First of all, media has a critical role to play in anything that has to deal with public narrative. And the information security is essentially an educational problem. So I think media plays an absolutely critical role in narratives surrounding information security. Absolutely. If you look at the example of US elections in 2016, media had an absolutely central role to play in terms of interference, foreign interference to be specific, in the US government elections in 2016. And media played a critical role in shaping public perceptions with regards to the overarching question of information security in the US. This is just one example from the global perspective. There are many other examples, similar examples that have taken place across the world, but this example has illuminated the debate more so than others. So propaganda is like a virus. So it affects a nation's cognition or an individual's cognition. So what propaganda does is that it creates an illusion of reality, which is not obviously not real. It does not represent the facts. It misrepresents the facts or creates alternate facts, and that in its own is a challenge for information, what you call an information insecurity. It is an environment that is rich in propaganda and lacks authentic information, and that is where the role of media comes in. If media presents information that is factually correct, properly sourced and cited, the opportunity for powers that engage in propaganda in a specific public space will be much lower. So it's getting increasingly different in terms of how you would decipher uh, authentic information from false information. There is a technology component to it. For example, if you look at certain platforms like Ground News, that gives you a comparative analysis of how the news is being sourced, where it is being sourced from, who is reporting it, and what is their political bias. And it color codes those news items in terms of where it is emanating from and what sort of target audience it is trying to influence. So technology is one component. Another component is, as we sort of go through this information age, the readers and the viewers themselves are becoming more aware and more cognitively smart in terms of the information they would deem as authentic. Obviously, that is relative from person to person, but there is an overarching reality that develops because if you, for example, if you look at anything, any item of news that is aired on a media platform or on the internet, it has become commonplace for people to go out and look for alternate sources and see where the news has been cited from, who is reporting that news, what is the political bias involved, and they base their opinions not only on the sources of news but also the public discourse that surrounds it on social media and other platforms. So there is a multi-tiered phenomena in terms of identifying which information is authentic and which is not. I think media literacy has a critical role to play in terms of enhancing credibility in media. I would like to say that media is a very loose term. So media is not just about television or radio and traditional means of information communication. Social media is probably the biggest component of media, which is individually sourced news, individually sourced reports, and the mainstream media can sort of regain its credibility if it goes towards data-driven stories, if it goes towards stories that have already been fact-checked, stories that have been properly cited, they have proper sources, they can be retraced, and they can be verified. And media literacy, I think it's a subject that belongs in the production room and in the editor's workspace. So the people who are responsible for curating our news, their literacy is absolutely important, because they need to realize that the public which is consuming the information they are publishing, they have become more cognitively aware and they have way more sources of information to verify what's being published. So it ultimately not only hurts their credibility but also their business. So media literacy inside the editorial circles and the production circles is absolutely critical. But when you talk about media literacy in general, I think there is a case to be made that it has become very difficult to convince, let's say, young demographic, to follow the newspaper, to follow traditional mediums of communication, for example, television or any other forms of communication. So if you find a young person, most likely they are going to get their news from a podcast or from a conversation online, from Reddit, and where information is being sourced from multiple sources and is being discussed at the same time. So media literacy definitely has a role to play, but I think it would have to be addressed at the root cause of the credibility problem. I think there is a case to be made for a triple helix of media, educational institutions, and also regulatory stakeholders to sit together and ask the question in terms of how they want to increase the credibility of media, because media does have a credibility crisis at the moment. And as I've already said, if these three tiers work together on creating information that is verifiable, it is fact checked, it is very well presented, very well sourced, and it can be traced back to a verifiable source, then that information will be a lot more believable than what we see on our television screens these days. I mean, if you, for example, go online and you look at different mediums like YouTube and talk shows and stuff, the thumbnail on those talk shows is typically a clickbait. You know, it does not communicate an authentic message. It says something different than what's contained in the video. So that's sort of a misrepresentation of facts. That's a misrepresentation of information. And if you don't add authentic sort of front image to a news item, then it's not going to have credibility. And ultimately, as this cycle continues, the audience, they become more and more suspicious of what they're seeing. And in that sense, it does create an information security problem, because the public does not know what to believe. They are being bombarded with information, but they do not know which information is credible and which one is not. For example, the best illustrated example that I can think of is probably WikiLeaks. If you look at the case of WikiLeaks starting in back in 2008 onwards, it reported on documents that were sourced through cyber tools, right? So it was a cybersecurity problem that led to a media effect, and it created a public debate of its own, and then it had a life of its own, which is obviously the WikiLeaks story is still going on. And cybersecurity in some cases does have a critical impact on how media presents itself, and how information security overall sort of corroborates with the sources of information and how information is verified, and whether or not the information they are working with is accurate. So I think cybersecurity is a critical component, and I'll bring you back to the US elections in 2016, where this became a global debate in terms of how alleged foreign interference in the US general elections were actually sourced in certain, cybersecurity related challenges. Hacked information, for example, Hillary Clinton's emails were hacked. And they were used for political purposes on the US media. So it was like a troika of media, politics, and cybersecurity. So I would say definitely an absolutely critical role to play. So media organizations are definitely exposed in terms of cybersecurity risks. There are certain steps they can take. For example, they can follow the global best practices. They can have their own internal, computer emergency response teams. They can upskill their employees to anticipate threats and mitigate those threats before they emerge. They can work with government sector stakeholders to sort of raise awareness internally in terms of their own staff and whether they are skilled to handle these challenges. And they will have to secure their networks. So a lot of these services, luckily, are available in the open markets. There are consultancies available. There are different cybersecurity organizations available that can secure these endpoints for you, specifically for media organizations. And I think the biggest risk for media organizations in terms of cybersecurity is a reputational risk. So if your reputation as a media organization is lost as a result of a compromised document or a hack, then most likely your viewers and people who follow you are going to have much less confidence than they already did. So I think securing endpoints and having a robust security architecture for media organizations is absolutely critical. I think the biggest challenge going forward is disinformation, and I will stretch this subject a little bit further because disinformation has developed a life of its own. There's a technology component to it. For example, there are deepfake um, videos circling, and they sort of are used for propaganda purposes. Then there is the artificial intelligence that can uh, create very believable stories and very believable even multimedia that can be used to sort of create this image of a falsified narrative. I mean, it happened when quite recently U.S. presidential hopeful Donald Trump was arrested, and false artificial intelligence based images started to circulate on the US media, and it created a huge rift among the public, and they got very concerned. Obviously later on they found out it was not true, and those images were generated by a generative AI software. So propaganda will become more sophisticated as we go forward because of artificial intelligence, because of machine learning, and all of the other use cases that are emanating from it. It will become more sophisticated in terms of its quality, it will become more sophisticated in terms of its reach, and it will become multilingual as the large language models evolve. The automated propaganda will enter into the domain of, um, let's say, multiple languages, not just English. So you'll see a lot of it coming into, Arabic, into Chinese, into Russian, and many other languages. So it will have a much wider reach in terms of geography. Its quality will be much higher, and it will be much difficult to detect and counter as well. I think there are emerging trends in this field that we should be mindful of. Is a lot of the disinformation activity is becoming more and more organized. You have different troll farms pushing a certain narrative in a certain country, trying to change public perception. It's becoming more sophisticated. I mean, if you look at the Indian example, um, the political troll farms in India are highly sophisticated as opposed to, let's say, how they were operating 5 years ago. And also, there are other examples. For example, Israel has run a highly sophisticated propaganda machine to, create a false narrative around their war in Gaza and other places in the world. So I think like I've said before, the organization part, and they have more resources available coupled with emerging and disruptive technologies, it's going to become something very difficult to handle in the future.